Back in April, with the government shutdown looming, Republican Senator Kay Bailey Hutchison issued a sober warning. The fiercest fight, she said, was yet to come. The battle over raising the debt ceiling would be, quote, Armageddon. Well, welcome to Armageddon. Washington is now in the thick of it. The clock is ticking, the parties are more polarized than ever, and the whole world is watching. Here with me now, our roundtable: George Will, Democratic strategist Donna Brazile, Al Hunt, the executive Washington editor of Bloomberg News, and ABC's senior political correspondent, Karl. Thank you all for being here. George, you just heard what William Daley said, blamed it all on politics for the collapse, and then said that the president would still go for the big deal.
This is politics. We have two parties for a reason, and they have different views of the proper scope and purpose of government. The Democrats are here with their own litmus test, which is we're here to defend the entitlement structure as it exists forever. The Republicans, who won the last election, are here to say we did not win the last election for anything other than to shrink the government. They want to shrink both the debt, the deficit and the debt, and the government at the same time. And part of the problem is that I think the American people are suffering apocalypse fatigue. They've been told over the last 40 years they're going to die from nuclear winter, global cooling, global warming, and they hear now that this is Armageddon. I don't think they believe it.
But George, you're suggesting that there's not a big catastrophe looming if the US government defaults, and every economist, including the head of the IMF, not the liberal lending and spending organization, but real sort of serious organizations, are really worried. Do you think there's going to be a deal in time? He said, William Daley said that he thought there would be.
Well, if you talk to Republican leaders on the Hill, not rank and file, they say there's got to be a deal. It's simply unthinkable that there won't be. But the apocalypse here is that we're spending more than 40 cents. More than 40 cents of what the government spends is borrowed money. You've got to have a deal, and any impartial observer knows what that deal has to include, which is some revenue increases and some cuts to the growth of entitlement spending. That was the direction they were heading in, and the very forces that got us into the mess in the first place made it impossible.
So, Donna, if the president, and he's floated the idea that he's willing to look at entitlements, which is what everybody says also has to be on the table. I suggested to Bill Daley that the president was late to the actual hard negotiations, and he obviously pushed back on that. But he has been sort of pushed into this debate by hardball Republican tactics. They're on Republican terms right now.
Well, there's no question. By coming into the debate at the time the president showed up, the Republicans had already framed the narrative, and it's cut, cut, cut. Well, we can't cut our way back to prosperity, nor can we cut our way to creating the kind of jobs that we need to sustain us in the 21st century. Here's the problem. The Republicans get cold feet every time you talk about raising revenue, every time you talk about closing loopholes, every time you talk about take away something from the wealthiest Americans. Democrats get cold feet when you talk about entitlement programs. George, every 2 years or every year we have a budget debate. That's where the partisans can come in and pick their sides and do this posturing. But this is about the full faith and credit of the United States of America, and we should not play political games. Something as serious as risking default. There's one thing I worry about, and that is our credit rating. Moody said last month in June, if the United States, the politicians don't get their act together, they are threatening to reduce our rate. That will have serious implications for us in the future.
For each and every individual American, because interest rates will go up, unemployment will go up. We'll hear from Christine Lagarde on the global ramifications of this in a moment. But Al, so where does one go now? If it's just politics, if it's just short-termism, if the holy grails of taxes and entitlements are not going to be in play, what happens?
They have to be in play, or they're not going to do anything that's substantive. It may not be Armageddon, George, but a default would be cataclysmic. It would be. I agree with Jonathan, or that there's no economist who doesn't believe that. Even a short-term default. Do you choose between Chinese bondholders and veterans? That's not a choice that we want to make. So they'll do something, I suspect. They may have to go a few times and have it rejected, and they'll probably have to do something rather cosmetic. The idea of a small deal. The $2 trillion, $2.5 trillion, that still involves entitlements and taxes. Joe Biden never agreed to anything that didn't involve taxes. So all it does is it's 60% of the big deal. And it's just as complicated and just as difficult. And in the end, if you want to do something substantive, there is no way you can do it without doing entitlement reform and without added revenues. Same reason Willie Sutton gave when they said, Why do you rob banks? That's where the money is.
And this short-term deal is going to be really difficult to pull off, even, $2 trillion, a lot of money, as Al points out. But the problem is that you have about 30 to 50 Republicans in the House who will vote no on any increase in the debt ceiling, period. That means you're going to need 20 to 25, maybe more Democratic votes on this thing. And if you're doing anything to touch entitlements, Nancy Pelosi's made it clear, no go.
Well, first of all, Social Security did not cost a mess. And the Democrats have been,
she's talking about.
Yeah, but Democrats have been very clear that we cannot simply continue to cut programs that benefit the middle class, that senior citizens, people with disabilities, without putting everything on the table. The Republicans, every time you put revenues on the table, they walk out the room, they say, no deal, we want a short deal. A short deal is a cop-out. This is about making hard,
Donna,
tough
everybody
decisions.
knows that entitlements have to be in play as well. And if it hadn't been for the hardball negotiations that the Republicans were doing, the president may not have come to even talking about entitlements.
He put it on the table, and the Republicans came in the room, got the appetizer, and said, you know what, main course, we'll just walk away. Maybe tonight the president will serve dessert. It's after 6 o'clock, George. I should be cooking.
Before we have a moratorium, I hope, on the can metaphor, let's look at who's been kicking the can down the road. Democrats started kicking the can down the road when they stopped writing budgets. The president kicked the can down the road by appointing a deficit commission. Then he kicked it again down the road by ignoring the deficit commission. Then he submitted a budget in February that no one on either side of the House would support that promised to increase the deficit. That's a lot of kicking. That's can abuse.
Let me ask you, because you've done some reporting. Speaker Boehner obviously has a hard time with his group in the House. Yeah. You've said that one of the things that were being considered in this mega deal, where both the president and Speaker Boehner were talking about a mega deal, was about some kind of revenue increases, as well as entitlements on the president's side.
$4 trillion in deficit spending, about $1 trillion of it coming from tax revenue increases. Republicans would simply call those tax increases. And the Speaker was willing to consider this, but at that White House meeting on Thursday, Eric Cantor said point blank, I personally will not support a deal like that, and most of the Republican conference in the House will also vote no.
They get cold feet. Every time you talk about raising revenues, they get cold feet. We got to have both in order to have negotiations.
And meantime, the obsession with the deficit is, American people say, at the expense of focus on jobs.
Well, yeah, it is. But let me just say, I think George is absolutely right about how Obama has handled this. But I also would point out it was Eric Cantor who walked out of the small bargain, out of the $2 trillion deal with the Biden. So this is the second Republican to walk out. And I don't know of anyone who seriously thinks you can solve this or begin to deal with this unless you do it on a bipartisan basis. This is not going to be passed. And every single group that's looked at it, whether it's Simpson Bowles, Domenici, Rivlin, has said you got to have entitlements and taxes. And that's what Eric Cantor and Nancy Pelosi won't face up to yet.
So about jobs, how are they going to move that from where it looks to be trending now, which is not in a very positive direction at all?
Well, talking about being able to walk and chew gum at the same time, what they really have to try to do is have some short-term stimulus, mainly through the tax code, and long-term deficit reduction. That may not be easy for people to understand, but I don't think very many people, whether it's Marty Feldstein or a liberal economist, thinks that we ought to begin cutbacks in this economy right now, whether it's tax increases or whether it's significant spending cuts. They ought to be done a year or two down the road. That's kicking the can down the road, but I think probably that makes economic sense.
Moratorium, please. Let's look at how bad the jobs numbers are. Go back to May, first of all. In May, they said we created only 54,000 jobs, which is terrible, but then they revised the May numbers down to 25,000 jobs. The June number is 18,000 jobs. You need 7 times that many just to stay even with the natural growth of the workforce. 16.2% is the unemployment, the underemployment, and the dropped out of the labor force unemployment rate. There are 2 million fewer private sector jobs in this country than there were before the recession began. When Obama was inaugurated, the unemployment rate was 7.6%.
Well, first of all, George, for the first 3 months of this year, we were creating 200,000 jobs a month. In the month of May, we hit the speed bump. As you well know, but the fiscal tightening all throughout the country, 400,000 jobs have been lost in the public sector. So every time we created 57,000 private sector jobs, and then we lost 39,000 public sector jobs. The president laid out some immediate things that the Congress can do, an infrastructure bank to get people back to work. He also talked about trade agreements to get people back to work, extending the so-called payroll tax by 2 points.
Patent reform he threw in there.
Well, but the question is, what will it take the private sector to create more jobs? And yes, another stimulus might help us alleviate some of the short-term pain at the state and local level where they're basically reducing jobs across the board.
Now let the record show, as Donna points out, that the president came out for a tax cut that is extending the tax cut on
Well, he's come out with 17 tax cuts, and the Republicans opposed 16 of them. So he's been walking your walk, but not talking your talk, clearly.
This is going to continue in the green room. Thank you all so much.